Welcome back to the Weekly Boost. This week, we welcome the host and creator of Antisocial Social Studies to the show. Emily is an educator in Texas and content creator that fills those adults in that may have slept through their high school social studies class or students looking to succeed in their studies. We'll talk about her path to podcasting, creating her brand as well, and we'll also address some current issues in the field. So without further ado, welcome to the show, Emily.
Hey, thanks. Appreciate it.
Yeah, I mean, this had to be a really difficult year teaching for you. So I hope you're, starting to enjoy the summer a little bit at least.
Oh my gosh, I've done nothing. It's been so amazing. Because yeah, this last year was weird for like three totally separate reasons that were all happening at the same time. An election year for a history teacher already is like a stressful thing, and then a pandemic, and then as we'll talk about some of the other debates about how to teach history, it was just like it was a lot.
Yeah. I took on like a couple substitute jobs down here, and it's like the day that I actually, worked at the high school here, it was in like a flex day. So I had the most students I had in a class was like 5. So it's just like a really weird scheme. So hopefully, with everything opening back up, I don't know what it's like in your district, but hopefully we move past that and get back in the classroom full time, so.
Yeah, that's the plan. I'm lucky I work at a really small private school, so we had a little more flexibility, but I had a lot of friends that were still in the big public schools I used to teach at, and I was like, it was a lot.
Yeah. So, well, let's start here because Austin and I started our podcast in August of last year for totally different reasons than you seemingly did. So what caused you to create Antisocial Studies and, some of the thoughts behind and kind of where has it gone today?
Yeah, it's really funny because when I explain this now, I realized that I was really stupid because I a few years ago just wanted like a more creative outlet. I had been in like a big public school for a while and was getting a little burnout, and I really just wanted some sort of creative outlet. And so I was like, I'm gonna make a podcast because every time I would tell adults that I was a history teacher, I got one of two responses. They were either like, I hated history because they had like a bad teacher, or they just didn't see the value in it in high school or whatever. Or they're like, I remember nothing. I remember nothing from the class. I wish I could go back and take it now. Like, that's what every adult told me. Is like, gosh, if I could go back and take my high school history class now, I would like understand it and value it so much more. And so finally I just was like, well, why don't I can just put my classroom sort of online, like kind of make it to where an adult could in theory like audit my class, sort of tune in and hear how I explain things. And so I toyed around with a lot of different ways, like literally doing adult classes, and then I realized, no, that's what podcasts are for. So I made the podcast, and what's dumb about it is that it didn't even occur to me that like students might like it. Like it didn't even occur to me that this would be a really useful tool maybe for kids that are currently in school. Like I didn't even tell my own students about it. They just seemed like two separate things. And then a few of my kids kind of found out about it and were like, it's really cool. And I just was so confused that they wanted to like listen to my voice more. So it's kind of morphed. It's become a thing where I feel like I have two separate audiences, where I have adults that just don't remember stuff and want to remember what the War of 1812 was or whatever. And then I also have a bunch of teenagers who use it to like study for their AP exams and stuff. So it's kind of this funny two groups that listen.
Yeah. When I kind of came across it through various platforms, I can't remember where I found it, but I was like, wow, this like is taking me back into APUSH, and I just like really appreciate a one-stop shop where you can just like follow history if it's world or US, whatever it is. And I think it's a testament to like seeing how your brand can shift, and you don't necessarily know the end goal of it, and like now you have these multifaceted kind of ways of this brand really.
Yeah, it's one of those where, because I started it, I guess 3 years ago, and there was no purpose. I just was like, I'm not going to think about it too much. I'm just going to start making it. And, the first year, I feel like I would put out an episode, and if I got like 200 downloads, I'd be like, yes. And I was so excited. And like, because I was like, hey, that's more than just my mom and her friends. So clearly there's someone else listening. And I kind of had no idea why I was doing it. And this is something I've told other people who have asked me about starting their own sort of whatever creative thing. I'm like, just don't overthink it. Like once you get an idea, just do it and don't question it too much. Because if you do, it's like, if you overthink it, you're going to stop doing it. And so I'm really grateful because now I feel like I've had an opportunity where I've gotten a lot of other opportunities because of the podcast. Like I interviewed at this kind of dream school that I had always wanted to teach at. And there's only like 3 history teachers at the whole school, and they all stay there till they retire. So I got an interview, and I had just started the podcast, and so I was able to just mention that, and my boss went and listened to the first episode and got to like hear how I teach and was like, oh, that's great. And then I got the job. Or there's been a bunch of random things where it wasn't the podcast itself, or now like I have a YouTube channel and that sort of thing, but I've gotten to connect with other people and get other opportunities just because people can find me that way. It's cool.
Yeah. One of the greatest things that Ben and I have kind of come across with this is the people that we're able to meet and talk to, and like the opportunities that were presented. They're kind of incredible, and you never think that in your lifetime you'd be able to do these sorts of meetings with people that you might think are your role models, or you kind of stay in communication or in touch via social media and like kind of follow them and like you're their little following or whatever. And one of the greatest things, which being that we're able to communicate with people, it also kind of reiterates the idea of how important communication is and how much we have to value this in order to kind of grow as a civilization or as, a human race. And one of the major setbacks of obviously everything going on is finding it difficult for that face-to-face communication. And Zoom can only do so much, but I feel like the podcast itself is a great way to just talk to so many people at once and kind of just feel that essence of just communication at its finest, being able to communicate in a way that crosses barriers and breaks divides. And I feel like with the modern discussions of historical events and stuff like that, it's a perfect example of ways to talk about it, is using this as a platform. And we can talk about so many great things that we've come across with podcasts, like people that we've met, ideas that we've been able to discuss and whatnot. But for us, we have our own challenges. So what were some of the things that that you found most difficult about starting your brand or starting your TikTok or your YouTube or your podcast in general? Like, what were some of your biggest challenges in order to kind of enlighten us as to what you were going through?
Yeah, well, TikTok is its own. We could have a whole podcast about the weirdness of being a millennial adult teacher on TikTok. But all my friends are like, why are you doing that? Like, why are you putting yourself there? And I'm like, that's where my listeners are. Yeah. But as far as the podcast, I think what I have always struggled with is, so teachers, I feel like there's a few professions, and teachers are one of them, that are forced to be or often just inherently more humble. Now, I'm not personally a very humble person, but like the job has forced me to be, right? Like the idea of valuing my own time, creating a brand, thinking that my voice would reach beyond my classroom, all of that felt super foreign to me, because I feel like in our society, we're taught that teachers are like, you get what you get and you should be grateful for it and that sort of thing. So it took me a long time to start to like treat it like a business. And I would constantly downplay it and be like, oh, it's this fun, silly thing I do or whatever. And it kind of took other people, like listeners I didn't know, reaching out to me being like, no, my kids use this. Like, we listen to you in class, or I'm a first year teacher and I don't know the content at all, and I listen to your episode before I go teach my kids. And like, other people almost have had to convince me that it's a more legitimate thing. So that was just hard, because for a while it was like the whole idea of branding. I feel so gross when I even say that, but it's like, you have to do it. You have to take it seriously and treat it like a business, or else it's not going to do anything. And then, I think the reason why I really liked podcasting is just because I struggle with I liked the one-way communication aspect of it, which maybe sounds bad, but I do just feel like, as someone who teaches, at the time I was teaching a room full of 30 teenagers 6 times a day, I was like, I don't need any more input. Like, I kind of just want a space where I can just tell my narrative and people can listen to it or not. And so what's been good, but also has taken me some time to get used to, is like now being on more platforms where there is more feedback, like doing a YouTube live and having a bunch of kids in there that are talking back and having their own views or whatever. And it's all good. I agree with you on like, it's important to have that communication, but the safest one first was the podcast, because I could just record it and be like, if y'all hate it, I won't know about it. But now on TikTok, like, I know. Yeah. I know when they hate it.
I scrolled through a couple of comment sections and it's like, wow, it's
it's like an Olympic sport in those, those comment sections. I'm like, whoa.
Yeah. And it makes your job all the more necessary in a lot of cases too. It's funny, as we kind of flow through this conversation, one of the questions I want to ask you was, and you sort of answered it already, is like finding it difficult to monetize and realize that it's like this real thing. Austin and I went through the same thing. And in the beginning, it's like we were just talking, like just having conversations, if people go back to us, whatever. But, as we, partner with the American Cancer Society and did a bunch of other things, it's like you have to, like you said, really put the time into it and realize that it's like a legitimate thing. And like you said, as teachers, you try to be, or you're taught to be humble, and and I also appreciate this transparency. Like at the end of every episode, it's okay, like you can find the transcript here, and these are my sources, because that is the biggest thing people are going to come at you. And I think that's another thing that's really key. And that's not, I don't know if it's like a humility thing, like being transparent, but it's like in history and social studies, it's super necessary.
Yeah. And it's been interesting too, because even like the sources, I'll get feedback, I'll get like negative feedback on my sources. Like some teacher was like, I can't believe you're citing Wikipedia in your thing. I teach my students. And I'm like, first of all, it's like a blog, like it's fine. Yeah. And I'm like, and I'm citing Wikipedia, like I looked up a date or something. I'm just trying to be transparent that like, heck yeah, I go to Wikipedia first and then I go to like,
exactly.
Right? That's how I got through grad school. I'm like, I would go there first and then figure out what I was looking for and then go somewhere else. Yeah. And I was like, I could lie and just not put it on there. Yeah. But I think it's good to show students too, like, no, you can use it. Just don't. I mean, I'm not getting like strong historical arguments from Wikipedia. Yeah. But I think it's and it's hard to like, one of the things that has surprised me is I started, I guess 2 years into it, I started a Patreon account and I felt really silly and was like, it was just going to be my mom, giving me a certain amount a month. And it's grown like really, I have, I think 400 or 500 Patreon supporters. Wow. And a lot of them are teachers who are giving like $1 a month, which is amazing. Mm-hmm. So they're not all, most of them are giving a really small amount, but that alone has been I felt weird asking for money. Yeah. But then I just explained it on one of my podcasts. And I was like, well, hey, I do have a full-time job and like, it'll just make it easier for me to justify spending the time. Yeah. And immediately, people were like, yeah, I find value in this. So all of that, it feels weird. I think we all have that imposter syndrome of like, who am I to do this thing?
Yeah. Fun fact quick before we jump into the conversation about stuff, continuing this. Wikipedia, what we were just talking about, great, starting point for a lot of places. So the whole conversation and debate about that is anybody can go in there and edit. Well, they had a little bit of like some controversy with all that sort of stuff. One of the things that seldom is edited are the references or the links. And so those are almost always true to the source. And so that's where I go first time. That's helped me with a lot of my stuff. And granted, I haven't, microbiology or like biology in general, a lot of the stuff in Wikipedia is little, you can be skeptical of that stuff because it's, that's not the primary source. It's more of like an encyclopedia at that point. But sources, that's a great conversation. Ben and I talk about this all the time.
It's literally, I teach my students that now. I'm like, I don't care if the English teachers get mad at me or whatever.
Exactly.
Scroll down, make sure it has a little number, go legit, find that source and make sure it's legit. But
we've just talked about it in a lot of our conversations when individuals or just we notice a debate or we notice just conversation about a hot topic, and seldom is referenced actual data. And when it is referenced, it's either they've got it from some non-primary source that is just spewing out a talking head version of a statistical fact or something like that doesn't necessarily relate to their topic, but they saw it with the subheading that related somehow in some way, so they assumed that it meant that data point meant the truth of that. And so I feel like with the transparency thing, it's excellent that you incorporate those sorts of sources, because not only does it I don't want to say it bolsters your argument, because you're not really trying to make an argument. You're just trying to give your narrative. And that's really like what your main point is. But giving individuals, even if they doubt what you're trying to say, or if they have some sort of comment or critique, you have it there for them. And you're meeting them more than halfway, in my opinion. And I think that's excellent. A lot of people need to do that. Being able to give, maybe 51% in this conversation, I'm going to give you that extra 1%. Here's the sources for my argument. Now you can base, and you can have a more concise, maybe a little bit more of a intellectual debate, rather than just focusing on, the stuff that pops out to you on the TV screen, and you're given a little bit more of background information. I just think that's excellent. I'm sorry that kind of went on a little tangent, but, I'm a big proponent of backing up your information with data, and I try to do it as much as possible, or at least something that's foundational. And I don't like the word saying that it's like true, but there's just something to it when there's like you reference a study, or you reference some a journal article. It holds some solid evidence behind it. Yeah, so it just
especially when a lot of times on the other side it's like there's nothing. It's like, okay, I'm not saying my thing is perfect, but you don't have anything. So like, exactly. I have at least something that's that's actually what I do in my classroom when I've had difficult topics, like when I've had students push back on whatever controversial topics, whether that's about race or sexuality or whatever. My response is always like, well, here's where I got the stuff. You go do some historiography and some other stuff, and like tell me if my source was bad. Like, go look at it. And of course, most of these teenagers are like, I'm not going to do that. But but if they do, it's like they're like, oh, actually, yeah, they did. That's pretty good. So,
Yeah. Austin, you've kind of been roped into this, and I kind of apologize for it, and I kind of don't. But, so you cite on your website, history and social studies is like the most important subject, and I couldn't be, more in agreement right now. But and Austin and I have talked about it in the past, but let's transition, because I really want to hear from an educator's point of view with this idea of critical race theory and what it is. Like, I have my, opinions about the vagueness of the bill that was passed in Oklahoma and things like that. But, it's this higher education legal theory, correct?
Yeah. Okay. This is what's so strange to me is like, one, I mean, again, I have a graduate degree in history. I've been teaching it for over a decade. I had never heard of critical race theory till the past year. I had never even heard of it. I looked it up and was like, well, that's weird. Why is everyone talking about that? And then I started to see, oh, people think it's this other thing. And then I read it and went, oh, that is kind of not, I don't do what they think I'm doing, but I was like, oh, that is something I actually use in my classroom. So, I mean, critical race theory, I don't even fully understand it, what it technically is. It's something you would learn in law school, or like a high level graduate course about the approaches to the law and systemic racism and that sort of thing. So the problem is that now people are just using it as like, to me, it's sort of like wokeness, like being woke in education and applying, anti-racism or talking about systemic racism or doing like diversity and equity work, which are all things I really believe in. Like, my whole career is based around that. So, it's been kind of a nightmare, just because it's just a bunch of people and they don't know what they're talking about. And I don't mean that in a way that they're ignorant or whatever, but it's just what's being said is completely different from what's happening. And it's like, as a teacher, you get that a lot, where your classroom is sort of your kingdom. And like, I mean, already in a school, it's like my bosses, sometimes I'd be like, do you even know what I do in my classroom? Like, do you even, like, I'm doing all this awesome stuff, and they pop in every once in a while. And so even more so parents, but everyone has been to school and everyone has had teachers. And so I do think there's this idea that everyone thinks they know what it looks like. And I will just say, like, and then we can kind of get into it, but like, I feel like I have insight into high school history classrooms better than 99% of the population. Like, I mentor history teachers every year through my podcast and stuff. I now have hundreds of teachers that like reach out to me, and not that I know everything they do. And I have not seen a single hint of the stuff people are worried about. Like, people are worried that we're teaching people that like all white people are racist and you should all just feel terrible about yourself, whatever. Like, I feel like I'm aware of hundreds of high school history teachers, and I've never seen or heard anything that everyone's freaking out about. So it's just been frustrating.
Yeah, I mean, we've seen it with pandemic stuff, and now with, critical race theory. It's like you said, it's like this vague talking point that people, inflict onto others, and they act like they, know, but like the educators themselves don't even know, and it's like this.
Yeah.
As I'm like looking through this historiography, throughout time, like I had I had African American historiography, where we basically went through like UB Phillips and went through like turn of the century stuff into like even today with Ira Berlin. But even there's like this trend of putting the stories back in like the, how am I trying to say this? Like the perspective is, or the story is told from African American voices. And I think that's like the larger trend in historiography. And like you said, for CRT to just like pop up out of nowhere, basically, like that's not what teachers have been doing for years in the classroom. Like it's already a trend by scholars, and now all of a sudden it's like a politicized thing that just pops up for someone else to argue, with each other about.
Yeah, and I think it's really hard because it's like, how do I say this? I mean, history classrooms have been super traditionalist, right? Like whatever's happening in the scholarship, it takes a full generation for that to trickle down. Because like by definition, I only know what I learned in school, and then I'm going to turn around and teach that. So it takes a long time. So, in the field of history, right, this whole idea of like culturally relative, which is what I kind of did my thesis on. I looked at like the conquest of the Aztecs, and historians had changed their understanding of Aztec practices over time to be like, oh, they weren't all just bloodthirsty killers or whatever. And so like that's been going on since like the 60s or 70s, right? It's like an emphasis on more social history. It's not just all presidents and wars, that sort of thing. And it's like it's now reaching the scholars that are, high school history teachers. And I just think the other thing I guess I will say is that as a parent, like if I just heard what some of these people are saying teachers are telling kids, then I as a parent would be horrified. I'd be like, I don't want my kid to go to school and just be told there's nothing he can do, he's racist, and black people aren't gonna trust him because he's white no matter what. Like that'd be terrible. So it's like I totally understand why parents who trust, the voices they're hearing are scared. But I wish they would also trust teachers that like no one's doing that. Like we all got into teaching because we love kids and we know them better than most other people in their life. So I just think it's hard because there's been this backlash about like college campuses being liberal hotbeds, and now it's going down to high schools. And the trick is that what people don't understand is that the way like high school history has always been taught has been biased. It's just been biased in a different way. So it's like the idea that there is this unbiased traditional narrative is just wrong. But it's, any change is going to be scary.
Yeah. And, that's the big word, right? Change. Everybody's, that fear drives so much. It drives people to the polls. It drives, there's so much that fear can do, and manipulating it and thinking, well, I don't want my kids to grow up thinking that they're automatically racist. And I want to, so I guess what you're teaching is not, CRT, right? But what does this kind of look like in your classroom? I've seen a few examples, but I kind of want to hear, what this looks like and how, educators can use these types of ideas without, white shaming, if we will, like you're sorry.
Well, and it's interesting because so I have like two perspectives on this. I have my history classroom, and then I also, my whole career, I've been lucky enough that I've gotten to teach some sort of class that's like a current events class, whether that's an elective or whatever. So like, there are two different lessons going on. So the one thing is that I feel like anyone listening, like just know, most teachers do not want to have this conversation with teenagers. They're terrified. Like they don't want to sit in a circle and be like, tell me about your racial identity. Like that is terrifying. I've actually tried to get more teachers to talk about it, and they're like, no, I don't want to do it. So the only people who are doing that are people who are like trained in it. Like I'm about to go through an 80-hour training at the end of this summer to become, because I'm one of the diversity and equity coordinators in my school. It's like an 80-hour training to learn how to talk to kids about race and identity. So no one else wants to touch it. So that's its own thing. But in a history class, all it means is, to me, it's like critical thinking. It's looking back at events and realizing that there were human beings with their own motivations there. So the example I used on TikTok was Bacon's Rebellion. I was like, so you can look at an event like Bacon's Rebellion, and like it was this concerted, it was a diverse group of people rising up against the planter aristocracy in Jamestown, and it was former indentured servants, poor white farmers, it was some freed black people, enslaved black people, and they like burned Jamestown to the ground. Mm-hmm. And then we'll talk about that, and then I'll show students like, and a few years later they passed this slave code that says no more indentured servitude, and slavery is passed down through the mother. And I just present that to them. And I'm like, let's think about this. Let's talk about this. And kids immediately make the connection. They're like, oh, they realized, like, we don't want these two groups. Like, if we keep having these former indentured servants that now are free and we've promised them land, that's gonna be a problem. And we need to kind of split these two groups up. Like, they can see it immediately if you're teaching them how to think critically. And that's like, no white person in their right mind would be feeling guilty because they're the same skin color as Bacon was. Like, that's just not a thing. But it's being able to look and see like, oh, there were other reasons. The systems we have today were created by people, and they were created by people for sometimes really bad reasons, and we don't need to feel bad about it today, but we need to know like it still exists.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Perfect. Yeah. And this like idea of, you know, it's like this weird thing to wrestle with too, because you grow up, you know, I'm a history buff, right? Like I read all the Magic Treehouse series, you know, and like you read all those stories, and you're just like drawn into history and the stories of our past, and undoubtedly that leads to, you know, idolizing certain figures or But you hit it right on the head there. You said like they're people of their time. They're people just like us. They didn't like necessarily think, 200 years down the road, like what is this going to do? Right. Like they have their own intentions. So, I mean, I think I know where you stand on this, but like it's totally acceptable then to, you know, critique and bring these figures down to earth without necessarily like bashing them and saying, okay, well, everything you did in history is unimportant because like Thomas Jefferson, for example, right? Like that he wrote about how it's bad, but he still like owned slaves, and he had a relationship with I don't know how old, but regardless, like he has.
He's like a teenager. He is the ultimate case study in this, right? Yeah. It's like he's a mess, just a total mess. And this is what I tell my students all the time. I'm like, I love George Washington. I love George Washington so much. I call him George in my class. I talk about how lucky we were that he was our first president. And I tell the kids, I'm like, we're gonna have a whole day where we're going to go into like, is it okay for me to still love George because he owned slaves and he took their teeth to make his own dentures.
And I read about that in the book that I'm reading about.
I told my mom
and you're like,
it was falsified like, that they were wooden teeth, and then it was actually they were from, you know, individuals that he owned. Like that, never would have known that. Like I was never taught that. And
no, and so it's one of those where I'm like, but I love him. I think he did so much for our country. I think we're so lucky. We could have had a Napoleon Bonaparte with all these other people.
Yeah,
and I'm like, so, and I just tell the kids, I'm like, we're gonna have space. Like we can hold two ideas in our head at the same time.
Yeah. Fun fact. Fun fact about that. You mentioned Napoleon, and this is where my microbiology expertise comes in. One of the major reasons why the United States gained 15 states out of the Louisiana Purchase, roughly 15 states. Not only a social injustice was occurring in the Caribbean on the French-controlled Saint-Domingue, yellow fever was one of the prime reasons why the United States became one of the country that is today, because Napoleon's efforts in the Caribbean and the threat of slave uprisings against their kind of dominion over that region, in combination with mosquito-borne illness like yellow fever. The French were forced to leave the area and then settled to sell the Louisiana Territory to the United States for pennies on the dollar because they wanted to invade Russia instead. So there's your little.
There's less mosquitoes in Siberia.
Yeah, a little bit, but then it turns out there's dysentery and typhoid fever. So they kind of lost the battle on both fronts. But that was sorry.
And they didn't
even, awesome. Yeah.
They didn't even figure out that mosquitoes were carriers for yellow fever until 1900.
They thought it was miasma.
Yeah, it's
stuff that comes out of the ground. It was just, you know, emitting from the ground. It wasn't something like a virus.
That's great, a really interesting,
great fun stuff. Yeah,
but
it was great.
But yeah, like this idea of George Washington and, you know, his farewell address and how he's portrayed in Hamilton, let's say, or like all these different ways, like we build up historical figures, but at the end of the day, like you said, like there's so many things that we don't know necessarily. And like I said, I told my mom about his dentures the other day, I think, and she's like, "Really? I didn't know that." And it's like, but that doesn't necessarily, cut him down and kick him in the knee, in the back of the knee, and now all of a sudden he's like,
we're not erecting statues to his teeth.
Exactly.
So
exactly.
This is the thing I talk to kids about too, and I will say, like, this is an example of how it's not, again, it's whatever we're now calling critical race theory. Like how it would be incorporated in my class is that I just leave space to have these discussions. So like, for example, when I teach about the Civil War, we talk almost none about battles. I'm like, you can go watch Ken Burns' The Civil War. I've seen it like 3 times.
Exactly.
There's so many things you can do. Go talk to your uncle at Thanksgiving. I'm sure he knows more about Gettysburg than I do. Like, it's fine. Yeah. But what we talk about is I leave a whole day or two to talk about the monuments. Because I'm like, that's what matters. Like, most people don't need to know about all the different battles to get through their day. But, like, there's a whole big conversation right now about what to do about Confederate monuments. And so I think that, like, the way that history teachers are incorporating this stuff is just giving students space to have these tough conversations in a safe space. Because, like, if they can't learn how to argue with a friend about a Robert E. Lee statue in a classroom, a controlled environment, then, like, they're definitely not going to be able to do it out in the real world. Right.
Well, I think it's amazing. We were all on the same wavelength because I was just going to jump into something like that and referencing the 4th of July, Independence Day, major federal holiday. And, Sunday. More times than not, we are seeing instances where historical monuments, figures, busts, statues, whatever you want to call of these individuals that were, I don't want to say termed on the wrong side of history, but they were a part of our, national history and are always or almost always reflected on in a negative light. But yet we still gave praise to these individuals in certain regions of our country. And so, like, you see the heavy debate of, removal of statues or removal of monuments that are in paying homage to these individuals or to these, sites of, I guess, Southern slave states or stuff like that. Like, when you're talking about that part of history, that's one of the more recent things that I've been seeing. So, like, what do we make of this? Because at one point it's trying to, the counter argument to keeping the statues is it's a part of our history and, like, we have to kind of accept it. But then at the other side of the coin, it's, well, what happened because of this was an extreme detriment to our, social society today, and the individuals that bore the weight of slavery have to live with the, the idea of this, and then these are physical manifestations of this. So, like, how do we manage this divide? Because it's a really hard one to, figure out.
Well, I think, and again, this is one of those where it's like my teacher brain is, and again, this is more like for anyone listening who thinks I'm just indoctrinating all their kids. And I will say, like, I have strong opinions, and I'm not one of those teachers that I'm like, you won't be able to guess how I would vote in an election by the end of the year. Like, they know, they're not idiots. Like, they know, but I think they also know that I'm a rational and, like, kind and safe person, that they're not going to be judged if they don't agree with me. Like, I built that relationship where then I can kind of share my views on some stuff. But with this, it's like, one, you can just have that conversation. Like, just even proposing that conversation in a classroom is so valuable. It's like the ultimate of what we're trying to teach kids to do. It's literally that exact question, being like, all right, 30 miles north of me is Georgetown, a small town outside of Austin, and their city council was having a debate. They had a monument to Confederate veterans up in the middle of their town. My sister lives 2 blocks from there. Like, okay, what should we do? What do you think? And just even giving them space to think it through. I think one of the things that bothers me, and I've talked to a lot of high school teachers that feel the same way, is this idea that teachers can indoctrinate kids. Like, if I can get them to listen to me, like, 20% of the time, I'm so lucky. And, like, have you met a teenager? Like, they have such strong opinions about everything. Like, it's so funny that the same parents who I'm sure would be like, oh, she never listens to me about their teenage daughter, think I'm somehow going to be able to, like, change their whole outlook on the world through a history class. But I think with the monuments, what I'd normally come down to just personally is like, well, what are you glorifying them for? Right? So if you have the Washington Monument, did we build that because he owned slaves, or because he was our first president who did all these other things? Whereas Robert E. Lee, it's like, well, are we building that because of some other thing he did? No, it's because he led the Confederate military. So it's like, that doesn't mean I'm saying 100% of Robert E. Lee is evil and 100% of Washington is great.
Yeah.
But it's like, well, why are we putting up those statues? And so I think the other thing that I'll do on the statues, you were talking, I think, before we started about like statistics and that sort of thing. I sometimes will just have my kids go research. I'll say, okay, go look. There's a great website that shows like the years when these statues came up. And I think we all know where this is going. It's like, they weren't built after the Civil War. They're built whenever there's a spike in civil rights.
Yeah.
And so most of them were built in like the 30s and 40s and 50s. And then I just asked them, like, why do you think that is? That's interesting. So even just giving them the opportunity to think for themselves.
Yeah.
I'm sure some people still think that's maybe too much. Like, I'm leading them to some conclusion, but I don't know.
Yeah, I feel like you're just pointing them into the direction of, critical thinking. If I'm being honest, because if what you're doing is actually combating that spoon-fed kind of ideology that of, okay, everything is that you're going to learn from me or in this classroom is going to be, this side of history, and we're going to shed a negative light on, that side, and we'll barely even talk about it, or if we do talk about it, we'll reference how terrible it is. I think giving somebody an opportunity to go in and do the research, I think that's the most important part, is being able to look at stuff in front of them, and instead of being indoctrinated or kind of just force fed this information, they're able to make a claim or a hypothesis or whatever on their own. And I think that's important. And then at the same time, you give them a space to talk comfortably, safely, as well as just promoting whatever they have to say. And I don't know about you, and you're an educator, so you probably see this every day. In the classes that I was in high school, it was like the teacher had to pull strength, like they pull teeth to get people to talk.
Yeah.
And I can't even imagine like these debates, like they're not easy. So like the fact that anybody would want to talk about it in the first place in the classroom, just, it's knowing that it's a safe space would be beneficial. But like it's hard to talk about. Like even Ben and I have a difficult time talking about these things, and I don't want to say we're adults, but we are, but we're nowhere near like we're nowhere we're nowhere near where we could be experience wise education, and yet we still try to come up with a discussion with these things. So I think you're pointing people in the right direction is the best way to do it, regardless of what they think afterwards. I think it's as long as they're in the right spot.
I would just interject too. You mentioned safe space, and it's come up a couple times. Growing up in rural Wisconsin, right? Like, not a really diverse, population in my schools, and I get to this liberal arts college, and it's like, okay, well, we're going to be talking about some difficult things. Like, this is a safe space, so let's just kind of like talk through these topics. And at first, you're like, okay, like, what are we talking about here? Like, why can't we just talk? But like, as a white person too, like some of these things are just difficult to talk through. So I really appreciate that you said, even at the high school level, giving kids a safe space, and even if it is just two kids going at it, one's playing devil's advocate, right? Like, I think that's just a really important point, that it's not like, it's not blaming people for certain views that they had or experiences that they have growing up. It's talking through these things and letting you make conclusions and find, the research and do that part of it, I think is really key.
Well, and what I totally agree. And the other thing too that is interesting to me, because I teach a lot of different classes, but I especially teach a lot of AP history classes, which is like, it's the closest we have to like a national curriculum, right? And the thing that I think would surprise most people is that how much the curriculum has changed even in the last 5 years. Because even when I took like AP US history, it was memorization. It was like, you memorize, you write an essay where you just factually give back the answer. That's not it anymore. Like I tell kids all the time, I'm like, I actually don't even care what you argue. Like you said, like, can you make a claim? Can you back it up with evidence? And their grade has nothing to do with what they argue. So if a kid wants to write an essay being like, no, building these Confederate monuments was in no way tied to civil rights movements, and here's my evidence why, they could get an A just as easily as someone else. Because the curriculum is now skills based, which means it's all about like doing those skills. The outcome, like what each kid ends up thinking about American history, is kind of irrelevant now to those courses, which I really like. And I think too, like the whole safe space thing, I know gets sort of like eye rolled by people who are like, oh, we're coddling kids or whatever. And it's like, well, one, they are still children. Like, we forget this sometimes, but a 16-year-old is still a child, right? So whatever. But also, it's what I tell my kids is I'm like, it's a safe space for dumb questions. Like, when you get out into the quote, when you're an adult, it's hard to like find an expert to be like, I have a really stupid question. This is something I feel like I should have learned 10 years ago, but like, what the heck is going on in Syria? Or where is Syria? Or whatever. Like, you just don't have that opportunity anymore. So I try to talk to my students about like, when you're in academia, high school, college, grad school, like you have this unique opportunity where you're like in a room with an expert. And so if you make it safe where it's like, don't feel dumb, you might ask a question and immediately realize, oh, that sounded really bad. But if you know that we're all going to give you the benefit of the doubt, that's the funny thing about people that are saying that all this like anti-racism work makes white kids feel guilty and bad, is I found it's actually the opposite. It's like really freeing for them, because what I can do is I can tell a kid, hey, look, like this has nothing to do with you. You know what I mean? Like you don't, like I grew up in a very affluent, very white suburb of Austin, and I felt so much white guilt just existing there once I learned about the rest of the world. And when I started to read about like systemic racism, I was like, oh, that's something I can really help with. Because right, we all know you can sit there all day and say like, well, I don't have a racist bone in my body, which is the thing people like to say. And it's like, great, then you're on our side. And like, let's look at the structures that are just out there existing. It actually like absolves people of having to feel like they have to constantly apologize for being white or not being white or whatever. And you can talk about something that's not personal. Like now you can talk about race in a way that's not like you and me. It's like, let's talk about the system that was put in place 50 years ago or 200 years ago. So it's funny, I've actually found it's like the opposite. White kids walk out of those discussions feeling more empowered and like they can actually help.
Sure.
Yeah. I want to say I'm appreciative of that feeling of relief, because I just like Ben grew up in rural Wisconsin, and so my access to a diverse population in the education system was few and far between. And so learning about it, I feel like I was given a relatively middle of the road education when it came to civil rights movement and the social and the other social injustices that have occurred in our nation's history as well as in the world. And I feel like I was given a pretty good understanding of this, but it did take until I was taught and kind of explained what systemic racism actually was. That is when I truly felt like, okay, I can be part of a solution here, and I don't have to, feel bad because I am associated with the ethnicity, the social class that has placed these sort of, implications and these kind of, negative aspects of human life on other people. I'm not the reason for that, and my guilt is absolved because I learned about, the correct way to go at and look at this situation, and sort of building the right tools from the get-go is important. And as educators, it's essential that we look at it that way, because, we get kind of a lot of light shed on us and how we're educating our youth these days anyway. Like, it's just like how it's a really big topic of discussion. And when we have such major conversations and major topics of debate, like our social classes and the instances, the confrontations, the cooperations in between, it's important that we kind of have a universal toolkit to go with it. And I think one of them is just being taught that you can be part of a solution, although history said otherwise about people that are associated with the same whatever you want to identify as. Like it's okay to realize that, hey, let's just be a part of a solution to something that we can actually grasp now that we're taught and we understand it. So the irony is like the only I might get myself in trouble here but like I feel like the only reason you should feel guilty is if you learn about it and then don't do anything, or you refuse to learn about it. So the irony, this is why this whole debate is so frustrating, because I'm like, no, actually, like the people who are learning about it like are so much freer and like can like move through society so much easier. You're doing your kids a disservice if you're like, we're colorblind, there's no difference, there's no whatever. It's like,
it makes your life so much harder, and it makes it so much harder to understand other people. And so it sucks because it's like, gosh, you're just making it so much more difficult. And the other thing I'll say is that like my real love is world history. Like my real love is like I teach AP World. I love it. I love teaching about it. And what's funny to me is like it's happening everywhere. Like this is the thing is people are like, why is it all that America's bad? It's like, well, one, that's not what we're saying, but two, it's American history. So like, so we're talking about the United States. I can tell you that when I teach about world history, we talk about, you know, Chinese beliefs about ethnic superiority in the Middle Kingdom. And we talk about colorism across Africa. Like, I think that it's funny that people are just like, well, why is America always the bad guy? And it's like, well, it's not, but also because it's a whole class just on the United States. So we're going to talk about good and bad things, but I can tell you as someone who's taught about Southeast Asian history, sometimes the Khmer Empire is the bad guy. And it's not like I'm not anti-Cambodia. Like it's kind of this, it's a self-fulfilling prophecy because it's like, well, if all we're doing all day is talking about the United States, then some stuff's going to come up.
Let's try to end this on a little more positive note, I guess. So
you bring it down. My kids
I know. Well, I just feel like Austin and I have been having like some really deep, like last week we talked about like whether or not intuition is real. So it's like, okay, like can we quantify it? Is it like, it's just like we get into like, what do we call them? Mental pretzels, right? Like,
oh yeah, that's our word.
It's brutal. But okay, so you mentioned George Washington, right? Like there's some good things, a lot of good things with him and, you know, some bad things. Is there another, historical figure that you kind of admire and like who's your favorite and why?
Well, let me tell y'all, I have her portrait over here.
I'm excited.
Her name is Eleanor Roosevelt and she's the love of my life. But my kids all know this. They like will buy me, like I just talk about Eleanor all the time. And I will say, every time I put this out there, I'm nervous that someone's going to prove me wrong, but I have found her to be uncancelable. I have not found anything yet, which is kind of amazing for someone who lived, you know, now almost 100 years ago, but I have not found a thing yet where we can be like, oh shoot, she actually, Eleanor Roosevelt I love, just because I think she's a great example of like, she was aware, like she was knowledgeable. It's probably no coincidence that she was a history teacher before she became first lady. So like she is a great example of someone who was aware of what was going on in the country, good and bad, and then was able to help her husband create, I mean, there are tons of problems with the New Deal and race and redlining and all this stuff. There's also a lot of things that were done kind of for the first time to try to include Black people, to try to include women. Like, so I just think she's a great example of someone where like, if you're just aware, you kind of educate yourself. There's also I joke that my colonial boyfriend is Roger Williams, who founded Rhode Island. He's the other one. You should look him up. He advocated for like, you know, he basically said that the Massachusetts charter with the king was void because they hadn't paid the Native Americans for the land. So like he's a great example of somewhere I'm like, no, they knew. Like people knew that like, are we kind of just stealing this land? It was like, no, they were aware. So I like those people because I think it combats that narrative that just like, well, no one had any idea that, you know, owning another person was bad until 50 years ago. And it's like, I like finding those people where it's like, no, they just, you know, they didn't think too hard about it, or they kind of ignored the people that were saying those things.
Well, and I think one of the great things that kind of has jump-started this idea of bringing back historical figures and kind of analyzing how influential they were, you know, they're good, they're bad, was the production Hamilton. Kind of like you know, making that into a major motion picture with like the live version of the production being recorded and kind of set up, and you know, Disney running with it and all that sort of stuff. But it brought to light something that, well, an individual in American history, for one, that was totally misrepresented, you know, throughout the history books. You very seldom are heard about him. And two, it kind of brought to the, you know, the spotlight some other sides of individuals. You know, you have George Washington in there, like some other characters, but they're never the major role like we think about them as today, like when we think about US presidents and the history of them. So like, you know, I just thought that was a kind of a cool, I don't want to say like pop culture trend that started, but it was nice to see, because I remember sitting down in AP government and politics class, and my teacher absolutely loved starting off the classroom every day, listening to you know, a musical piece from the Hamilton score. Like absolutely every day we'd come in and it'd be a different piece. That was before it was like the movie. It was actually on Broadway at that time. So
history teachers were like, this is our moment.
Yeah.
No one's ever made something cool with the things we do. Yeah. We were like so excited.
Yeah, because like for the longest time, like Wicked was the big production, and so like all my music teachers were like, "This is the coolest thing ever." And so then now my favorite history teacher was like, "This is our time. We got this. And we're gonna talk about Hamilton." And we would do that. We would actually sit down and discuss, like the whole Federalist anti-Federalist debate because we listened to a song in Hamilton for 5 minutes before and so I'm like, hey, that's a pretty cool application of something that you don't. That kind of gets put in the background when you talk about our history is these individuals that come up that are really influential that don't get the credit they deserve.
And they were just regular people. I think that's like tying it all back to the beginning of like one of the reasons why I think my podcast has resonated with kids when I didn't think it would was because I was making it for my friends. So like when I was writing the episodes, I was like, how would I explain this to my friend about like, well, anyway, Eleanor Roosevelt's like, hey, FDR, blah, blah, blah. Right. And it's like, I think in doing that, I think if I had thought my audience would be kids, I would have been a lot more academic about it. But I think instead kids are like, oh, they're real people. Like I throw in pop culture references or I kind of translate what they were saying into kind of modern day lingo. Because I remember the moment where I had that realization. It was with my AP US history teacher, who I'm actually now working with to make YouTube stuff, which is pretty cool. But I remember her making some joke about George Washington putting his pants on one leg at a time. He's like, she did it like everyone else did. And I don't know why, but that was the moment where I was like, oh my God, they were real people. Yeah. Like George Washington like had to put underwear on and pants on. Like if for some reason that like opened things up and was like, now history is so much more interesting when you realize they're just like real people.
Yeah. And like, despite the things that have surfaced about some of the inaccuracies of Hamilton, like it did its job in the sense that it got people talking about it, and it there was a resurgence of, what do we call it in our race and gender in early America? Founder chic was like a trend at the turn of the century, right? Like that you're like these biographies on all these founding fathers, and here, you bring to light some of the darker things involved with Hamilton, while also his accomplishments. And I think along with Hamilton, are there any good book recommendations you would give for people getting back into studying social studies from maybe an adult perspective or something different than the traditional classroom, I guess?
Yeah, I mean, if you're looking to sort of upend or undo, like if you did have the traditional just like American histories like George Washington, D-Day, like woohoo. I mean, there's stamped from the beginning is like the one that's Ibram X. Kendi, who, I mean, his whole book is like, it's called, the subtitle is The History of Racist Ideas in the United States. Now, if you're like a little iffy on CRT, you might not start with that. That probably is just, it's like jumping into the deep end, but that really changed my view. Like I was reading it going, oh wow, I thought I understood some of this, and it's a lot more complex than I realized. But there's a ton of amazing books out there that are actually geared towards high school kids, which is amazing, and also means that like an adult can read it very easily. It's not like a dense textbook, that are focused on, like I use excerpts from one of my class that's called like A Queer History of the United States. And it's all these just like highlights of every chapter is an LGBTQ person in history that is like, you've probably never heard about this before, or maybe you didn't realize Langston Hughes was openly gay, or that Eleanor Roosevelt had like a lifelong female friend, like all these different things that I just think make, people, one, just more interesting. And then also, there's just people that haven't been written about, or parts of their identities that we didn't know about. And then Zinn, I don't know if y'all read Zinn.
I have it on audiobook, but
that's sort of the go-to like counter narrative is Howard Zinn. But and that's another great one that'll kind of blow your mind about some aspects of history.
Yeah, it's a really promising time too, because I have two friends that are just entering high school social studies teaching. So we can kind of close here. Like, do you have advice, not necessarily for them, but, newer teachers that, because it's really daunting looking outside or looking in the headlines that like, okay, well, all these dominoes are about to fall and all these states are going to ban this and you lose funding if you talk about this in class. And so what can you kind of give for advice that's not that daunting, I guess?
It's not like don't do it. Literally in my comment section, people will be like, I'm about to become a teacher, and other commenters will be like, don't do it. And I'm like, no, that's not what I'm saying. I think one is like don't overthink it. Like, what's funny to me is, first of all, like, your first few years of teaching, you're not gonna have the time to do any of this stuff. Like, I think one of the things that's so hard about teaching is it's one of the few jobs where you on your first day are working side by side with someone who has 30 years of experience, and you're doing the same job. You know what I mean? It's like, and so you then compare yourself to someone who's been teaching and building this curriculum and these for decades, and you're like, oh shoot, I'm not doing that. So your first few years are like, you stick to the textbook and you just teach the history and you try to make it interesting. And like, I think what's funny is that all of these conversations come out anyway. Like, you don't actually have to push. If a kid wants to talk about this or wants to think more about it, they're going to. And so I think that there's a lot of teachers out there who feel like, oh, I'm going to have to like make a decision and draw a line in the sand. Am I going to teach it this way or this way? You can just teach the facts and then open up space for a conversation, and what those kids say and think is sort of on them, and you help guide them. But the other thing is just that, like, you have so much to do in a year that, like, just don't plan a lesson where you're like, we're going to sit down and talk about whiteness today. Like, just don't do that. You don't have to. You can teach American history incredibly well and still teach kids to be critical thinkers without jumping into the deep end your first year teaching or whatever.
Yeah, and it's all about everything's like that, right? You start somewhere and you just keep building and always keep learning. This has been a phenomenal conversation. So we thank you really so much for joining us. And where can everybody find you?
Yeah, so I'm at Anti-Social Studies. So I have a website, antisocialstudy.org, and then a YouTube channel and TikTok are where I'm the most active currently, which is terrifying.
All right. Well, if you enjoyed this conversation, you can find more there. And like you said, like, you're really transparent about everything, and your website's .org. So that means we can use it in our high school papers, right?
It's legit, right? I don't know why. They just let me pick. I was like, I can
Sweet.
Like, I want a .org. It sounds legit.
Yeah. Awesome. Well, this is a pretty apropos conversation too, with this releasing on the 5th. So we hope you enjoyed, and stick around. We got some fun content in the coming weeks. So
thanks.
Thanks again.
Thanks, Ray.